All right, addressing an issue that comes up a lot in private messages here, eliminating junk miles. And this is a question we get a lot, especially since in a lot of work on the hybrid athlete, one of the points I've repeatedly driven home is how critical it is, especially when you're performing in multiple sports or looking to perform in multiple sports, how critical it is to eliminate junk miles or the miles that really don't do anything for you. Now, this doesn't just apply to running, it doesn't just apply to endurance sports. When I say junk miles, this can also apply to lifting. Basically, junk work. This is, and well, as we'll see in the definition right here, what is a junk mile? Well, I'm not going to read the bullet points, but you can see the major points. Junk work is fatiguing, minimal to negative returns, and basically not doing it can actually result in a net improvement. Now, is this always the case? There seems to be a certain benefit to just, in many cases, doing more work. You look at elite athletes, they do a lot of work, but they also do a lot of quality work. So how can you identify what is truly junk miles? What is work that is actually giving you some sort of productive return versus what is work that is actually holding you back potentially, or work that is only returning a marginal improvement that is better removed and replaced with something else? So we're going to go through each one of these points. Now, junk miles are fatiguing. Now, when we talk about productive work, we want to differentiate between work that actually has a net stress, work that is designed to have a training effect versus work that is not. There is room for work that doesn't have a training effect. I mean, anything that doesn't have a training effect can be considered active recovery or recovery work. This is work that has no net adaptive stimulus on the body. What that means is you are not stressing the body's parameters versus over what is currently capable of doing, and therefore it is not necessarily generating any level of fatigue. So when we look at that, we say, okay, active recovery, as you can see below, it results in increase in recovery parameters, whatever you choose to measure. There are several that we can go by. As I said, HRV, sleep quality, resting heart rate, focus, digestive issues are a big one. So active recovery is work where when you do it, you actually see an improvement in these outcomes. Training, on the other hand, may not necessarily result in improvement in these, but you will see an improvement in performance parameters. This seems fairly intuitive, right? Now, one quick point here. Many people say, well, fatigue masks fitness. How about overreaching, et cetera, et cetera? Overreaching is not a strategy I ever endorse. The entire idea of training to overreach to deload is more or less bankrupt. You look at a lot of the data on overreaching, and yes, it shows short-term transient improvements in performance, but long-term, these transient improvements in performance are masked or even eliminated by the need to back off through a deload and return almost to baseline. So what you're getting with overreaching is a short-term exhibition of superior performance, which can be useful when, say, peaking for an event, but overall is deleterious for an athlete during a regular training phase. Last bullet point here is critical. Each additional unit of training should return a sustainable unit of performance. Sustainable is key as well. Unsustainable means you are making progress at the expense of long-term fatigue. Long-term fatigue and long-term negative impacts to an athlete has a snowball effect. Over time, you start to see the compounding effect of negative fatigue, and eventually the amount of time you have to take off, take away from training, outpaces any superior progress you made during that time. Now let's look at the whole diminishing returns idea. Each additional unit returns an incrementally smaller benefit. Now, this red line represents fitness right here. As you can see, as the total amount of work increases, the total amount of volume you're doing increases, you start to see better and better results, but there is absolutely diminishing returns. Of course, if you are an elite athlete operating at the very high mileage, high volume level, and the differences in performance between first place and coming in near dead last is 1%, you obviously want to be operating on the far right side of this. So that's going to make a major, major difference. Now, if you are a multi-sport athlete, of course, every single sport you have will have this red curve. Now, it's important to remember the blue line just sort of represents a rough level of fatigue. Fatigue is linear, fitness is not. What that means is no matter what level you are at, this linear increase in fatigue will happen. Things can modify this, but it doesn't matter how good you are, there always will be a point where your fatigue outstrips your fitness. Now, you can shift that blue line, of course. You can reduce your overall fatigue level, thus allowing you to perform more work by doing things like maintaining a caloric surplus. Obviously, being a restricted caloric level reduces that, getting more sleep, lowering background stress, etc. Now, another critical thing is also athlete mechanics. If you are a larger individual, you are a larger runner, for example, fatigue will accumulate a lot faster simply because the additional wear and tear of every incremental mile. If you are a 110 kilo runner versus a 90 kilo runner versus a 60 kilo runner, that incremental fatigue or slash, fatigue as a proxy for overall systemic stress will increase much, much faster. So the amount of productive work you can do can actually decrease. One of the best things you could do is be, of course, to lose weight, but for many hybrid athletes or for many individuals who are looking at multiple different performance parameters, that's not always an option. So that is critical to remember. Now, when we talk about elimination improving return, what that basically means is, subjectively speaking, if you take out a session, you're going to improve your training performance. Okay, what the hell does that mean? Well, you can observe a couple training measures. Now, it is very, very critical for every athlete and coach to think of several different objective training measures that can measure their overall state of recovery, overall fitness, beyond just simply doing the 1 rep max, because a 1 rep max is prone to so many, or a 1 rep max or a race distance test is prone to so many mental issues as well that it's not a great proxy. Broad jump is one excellent measure to show overall state of nervous system recovery, strength, mental engagement, etc. That doesn't carry the same sort of mental baggage as an actual 1 rep max performance. Also looking at performance at 90% of your 1 rep training max or 75% repetition test. If you have an athlete who regularly can perform 11 to 12 repetitions at 75% of their current 1 rep max, then obviously tracking that week to week to week and occasionally retesting that every 3 weeks will give you a pretty good sense of how they're doing. Other metrics for more endurance athletes: resting heart rate and, of course, heart rate recovery. Heart rate recovery is an excellent test to see if an athlete is overall overtraining. Heart rate recovery refers to your ability to recover from, let's say you are at a heart rate of 155 during an interval. After 1 minute, what does that heart rate drop by? That number should, of course, improve with training, but it, of course, remains fairly static week to week to week. It is something that is absolutely critical to track. Now, if you notice that there is a downturn in this, then of course you are noticing early phases of overtraining. And if you notice that if you skip a session or two, which is worth trying, and your performance improves, then very likely you are experiencing too many junk miles in your program. Now, next phase, once you have those metrics for testing, what you need to do is develop a training hierarchy. If you look at this talks about how every single movement, every single session in your training has a level on the hierarchy of importance. Absolute most important or most specific, sport-specific, complete carryover movement or session. Again, I'm not going to read these. You can look at these. We're going to be on the slide for a little while. This primary performance parameter work, this sport-specific work, this sport skill work is considered to be 100% the highest carryover. Now, of course, all your training can't be this because it tends to be very fatiguing, but this is work on the competition lifts. This is work, directly, we're not talking modifications. We're not talking accessory works. We're not talking base building aerobic work. We're talking about actual race or competition level style movements. You move down from that, you get primary performance parameter improvements. This is additional work that is not necessarily sport skill work that specifically improves your ability to perform sport skill work. Moving down there, support a primary performance parameter. These are things that allow you to engage in the work one tier up. That is, as you move down the tier, think about what the primary sport skill work is. As you move down the tier, think, okay, what supports that? Okay, what supports the work that supports that? What supports the work that supports and so on and down the line. And you can see that as you go down this list, you get further and further away from the sport skill into work that is just supporting your ability to support the sport skill. When you get down near the bottom, you get to things like supportive secondary or tertiary parameter, quote-unquote injury prevention. I hear people talk about doing a lot of lifting for injury prevention. The amount of lifting required for injury prevention in running an aerobic sport is so absolutely minor. The amount of accessory work that you need for injury prevention in lifting is relatively small. People talk about running, miles on your feet that you need. Well, quite frankly, a properly designed running program with solid aerobic base work, solid race-specific distance work, et cetera, is all going to give you plenty of miles on your feet. So going out with the simple objective of putting miles on your feet doesn't make any sense. That should be almost this should be something that almost happens by accident by virtue of the fact that you're putting in enough training miles. Developing sport skill for a secondary parameter movement. This is also important. If you are incorporating Olympic lifting into your routine because you think that that will have some benefit to your primary sport, the time spent learning how to do these Olympic lifts and practicing the Olympic lifts is all the way down here under supportive secondary or tertiary parameter. And finally, at the bottom, you get non-specific support, greasing the groove, maintaining a schedule, going out and doing a session and just, phoning it in because you know you're supposed to. That is the lowest quality of work. Now, the other thing we get into very often is what we consider productive for a leading indicator, but unproductive for a lagging indicator of performance. Normally that sounds good. Okay, if what we're good at, we want to capitalize it, but if it's unproductive for lagging, that's bad. This depends on your phase of training. If you are putting in additional work that is simply letting you improve in an area that you are already peaked out on for your training phase, this is basically junk miles. If you are in a phase that is meant to specifically address a weakness in your performance, and you continue to do work that simply makes you stronger in areas which are not the current limiting factor or training objective of your phase, this is a very, very common trap. People very much like capitalizing on areas in which they think they perform well, and they think, okay, well, so I'm not really improving so much on the things that I'm not great at, but here I am focusing on my strengths. It is the things you are not great at that you are trying to focus on in a given training phase to, of course, improve your overall outcome, you improve your overall performance. Doing something that is unproductive for these admittedly lagging areas of fitness is not a good idea. So yeah, this is a case of people doing the stuff they want to do, not the stuff they should be doing. So be very, very critical with yourself on that. So how do you know if you're doing too little? Well, yes, as we mentioned before, most hypertrophy, strength endurance work are volume dependent, more training, better results. Now, the issue here is they all create similar fatigue. Junk miles of productive work, similar fatigue, but very different fitness. The next chart we're going to look at is basically what this looks like. And I'm just going to leave it up for a little while so you can check it out. But you do a 4-phase analysis when you are not progressing or progressing slowly with high fatigue. So you eliminate the lowest work on the hierarchy. Go back to the hierarchy you created, look at every single set, repetition, workout, and put them on that hierarchy. Eliminate the lowest work. After a week, retest your parameters. Replace the work with work that is 1 phase higher on the hierarchy than it was originally. Not all the way at the top, mind you, because a lot of the very productive work at the top you can only do so much of, the high intensity type work. In other words, replace that secondary support work with direct secondary work, and so on and so forth. After a week, retest parameters. And then you get to this. And you can see basically a lot of this seems fairly intuitive. If after this, you can see on the whole parameter here, this whole chart, fatigue decreases, stays the same, or increases, performance decreases, stays the same, or increases. If you're doing too little, obviously, fatigue will decrease, but performance will decrease. Anything where you see fatigue decreasing gives you the opportunity to put in more work. The question is what work? Of course, if fatigue increases, one of the areas you want to look at here is the upper right, where if performance is decreasing, you're doing more specific work, but fatigue is staying the same or increasing, you may want to consider changing your training phase. In other words, you may be horribly overreached at this point, you may be irreversibly overtrained, or, most importantly, you may be in a phase of training that you are not, or your athlete is not, in a physical position to be able to handle. You may have an athlete going into a peaking phase when really they should still be in an aerobic base phase. They do not have the aerobic base required to do the level of work at the level of intensity for the outcome that you want. Or if you have an athlete that is, of course, going into like a competition phase or going into a realization phase, but they are unable to do the productive work or unable to handle the loads that they should be, it means you probably missed the boat in an earlier phase of training. You may want to revisit that. This is, unfortunately, a very common problem. Now, all of this means, of course, that, somehow in the process of trying to analyze junk miles, you also end up looking at a lot of other parameters. You look at overtraining parameters, you look at performance parameters, etc. But the way to eliminate junk miles, again, is not an easy answer. It's not like, here's how much work you should be doing. It's all very dependent. But remember those critical things. Remember, develop a hierarchy of training skills, proficiencies, and everything else. Develop a set of parameters you can test and retest over and over again that the athlete does not have an emotional connection to, and develop a rubric for eliminating and replacing these objectives, and be flexible on your training phases. So that's it, basically in a nutshell. Hopefully there was at least a couple points to consider here. Sorry for not doing the normal stand in front of the camera thing, but this is so much easier. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.